"This restaurant isn't for people like you," the manager said to the man with a tattoo-covered arm. Then, the lawyer did this. "Hello. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment below. Enjoy the story." As the sun filtered through the windows of the cafe, Luis Torres, a 39-year-old attorney, stepped out of his car and entered a family shelter. Today, he wasn't wearing his usual suit and tie, but rather a simple t-shirt and jeans with his ID tucked away. It was his day off, a rare moment to unwind. The cafe, a local favorite known for its delicious sandwiches and cozy atmosphere, called out to him with the aroma of sizzling empanadas and freshly brewed coffee. Luis had frequented this place since he moved to the neighborhood 5 years ago, drawn by its warm, inclusive vibe and friendly faces. As he pushed the door open, the familiar jingle greeted him, followed by the soft murmur of conversations and the clatter of dishes. The interior was modest, decorated with framed photos of iconic places in Los Angeles and booths lined with blue vinyl. It wasn't busy today. A few families and solitary diners enjoyed their meals. Luis's eyes scanned the room, looking for a friendly face. He found one in Maria, the waitress who had served him countless times. She greeted him with a nod and a smile, approaching with a menu in hand. Luis headed to his usual booth by the window, the one with a view of the bustling street outside. Settling into the booth, he felt a sense of relief. Here, he was just Luis, not Attorney Torres. He looked forward to a simple pleasure, a savory sandwich with extra pickles, just the way he liked it. As he prepared to read the menu, his relaxed state was abruptly interrupted. A heavy hand slapped the menu before he could open it. Startled, Luis looked up to meet the eyes of a man he didn't recognize. This stocky man with a stern expression was definitely not the usual manager. The atmosphere around him became tense. The friendly murmur of the cafe faded into the background. "What's the matter?" the man asked with hostility in his voice. "Are you lost?" Surprised by the confrontation, Luis responded with a calm yet confused tone. "I'm just here for a sandwich, like always." The man leaned in, scrutinizing Luis from head to toe with a disdainful look. "This isn't the place for people like you," he stated coldly, snatching the menu and tossing it onto another table. Luis's heart sank as he processed the words. The cafe's atmosphere palpably shifted. What once was a sanctuary now felt like a battlefield. "People like me?" he stammered, his voice a mix of confusion and rising anger. The man sneered, "Yeah, people who look like you." His piercing gaze then turned away, leaving Luis sitting there with a storm of emotions swirling inside him. The once comforting smell of sandwiches now left a bitter taste in the air. As the man walked away, Luis remained frozen, grappling with the blatant discrimination he had just faced. This encounter didn't just ruin his day. It was a stark reminder of the underlying currents of prejudice that still permeated even the most familiar places. The initial shock slowly settled into a simmering resolve. Luis knew he couldn't let this go. This moment, painful as it was, awakened something inside him. A need to stand up, not just for himself but for anyone who had ever been told, "This isn't your place." As the man's words lingered in the air, a heavy silence fell over the cafe. The familiar sounds of laughter and chatter were now replaced by an uncomfortable hush. Luis remained stunned, glued to his seat as the man walked away with a dismissive wave of his hand. The other diners, clearly uncomfortable, avoided eye contact, choosing instead to focus intently on their meals. But Luis couldn't let it go. His role as an attorney compelled him to confront injustice, but more than that, his personal dignity was at stake. He rose from his seat, his heart pounding in his chest, and followed the man to the counter. "Excuse me," Luis called out, his voice firm but controlled. "I think we need to talk about what you just said." The man turned, his expression hardening. "I meant every word," he snapped. The nearby diners paused, their bites halfway to their mouths as the tension escalated. Luis, standing tall and composed, responded, "You can't deny service based on someone's appearance. That's illegal." A mocking laugh escaped the man. "Oh, the lawyer's going to teach me about the law?" he taunted. Before Luis could react, the man shoved him roughly in the chest. The push caught Luis off guard, and he stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. His legal instincts kicked in. He could handle himself in a physical confrontation, but he was off duty and without his ID. Still, defending himself now was a necessity. As Luis regained his balance, the man advanced, throwing a clumsy punch aimed at his face. Luis dodged nimbly, his training evident in his movements. He grabbed the man's arm, twisted it behind his back, and pushed him against the counter. The physical altercation elicited gasps from the onlookers, their meals forgotten. "Enough!" Luis shouted, his voice resonating in the now silent cafe. He hadn't wanted it to come to this. Struggling and cursing, the man tried to break free, but Luis kept his grip firm. In the scuffle, a sharp pain shot through Luis's shoulder, a reminder of an old injury from his years in law school. He gasped, the pain reflected on his face, but he maintained his hold. Finally, realizing the futility of his efforts, the man relaxed, and Luis released him slowly, ensuring he didn't make another move. Gasping, Luis straightened, his eyes scanning the room. The spectators were a mix of shocked and amazed, but no one stepped forward. Breathing heavily, Luis addressed the room. "This isn't just about me. It's about standing up against hatred and discrimination. If we let it slide with one of us, it sets a precedent for all of us." The man, now subdued, muttered under his breath as he rubbed the arm that had been restrained. Luis knew he had won the physical confrontation, but the victory felt hollow. There would be consequences. He was a lawyer involved in a public dispute, and his actions today could lead to scrutiny or, worse, disciplinary action. With a deep sense of foreboding, Luis gathered his belongings and left the cafe without his meal, his appetite lost to the bitter taste of confrontation. As he stepped out, the bright daylight seemed harsh, reflecting his inner turmoil. He wondered about the repercussions of today's events, both for his career and the community he had sworn to protect. He knew this incident wouldn't simply fade away. It was a spark in a powder keg of social tensions, and Luis was now at the center of it. Luis sat in the quiet of his living room, the events at the cafe replaying in his mind like a bad movie. His shoulder throbbed painfully, a physical reminder of the altercation. He had applied ice, but the deeper pain, the sting of injustice, was harder to soothe. His phone lay beside him, silent as if the world was holding its breath. But the peace was short-lived. His phone buzzed incessantly, texts and calls lighting up the screen. It was his boss, several colleagues, and a few unknown numbers, probably the media sniffing around. With a deep breath, he picked up the phone to call his boss first. "Luis, what the hell happened?" His boss's voice was a mix of concern and reprimand. Luis explained the situation as calmly as possible, emphasizing his attempts to de-escalate and how things had spiraled out of control despite his efforts. "I didn't start it, sir, but I couldn't just stand there," Luis said. "I know, Luis, I know," his boss sighed. "But you know how this looks, right? An attorney involved in a public brawl. It's not good. Internal affairs will be all over this first thing in the morning." Luis nodded, even though his boss couldn't see it. "I understand. I'll go in and give a full statement." After hanging up, Luis felt a sinking feeling. He knew his boss was right. The implications of this incident could be severe. Despite his intentions, the optics were damaging. He needed to prepare for the fallout. His personal phone rang next. It was Carla, a single mother he had recently helped through a legal aid program. Her voice was filled with concern. "Luis, I just saw a video of the fight at the cafe. It's all over social media. Are you okay?" Luis hesitated, then admitted, "I've been better. Thanks for asking, Carla." They talked a bit more, her concern a small comfort in the storm brewing. After promising to keep her informed, he hung up, feeling the weight of his isolation. Despite the quiet of the room, his mind raced. Tomorrow, he would face the consequences at the law firm. Luis entered the firm the next morning, a palpable tension greeting him as his colleagues eyed him with a mix of concern and curiosity. He was immediately led to the Internal Affairs office, where he spent the next few hours recounting the incident, his words recorded, and his demeanor scrutinized. After what felt like an eternity, he was allowed to leave the interrogation room. As he stepped out, he noticed a group of reporters gathered outside the firm. His heart sank further. The story wasn't just internal now. It had caught the public's attention. As he approached, the microphones were pointed in his direction, and questions were fired at him like bullets. Attorney Torres, were you racially profiled at the cafe? Do you believe the law firm supports you? What will you do now? Luis paused, looking at the sea of faces waiting for his response. He knew he had to be careful with his words. With a firm voice, he said, I believe in justice, not just for myself, but for everyone. This incident will be thoroughly investigated, and I trust the truth will prevail. He didn't stop for more questions, walking through the crowd toward the uncertain days ahead. The repercussions of the incident at the cafe rippled through the community, provoking a mix of outrage, support, and divisive debates. Luis found himself at the center of a storm that extended far beyond the confines of the local cafe. As he walked through his neighborhood, whispers followed him like shadows. Some residents nodded in solidarity, while others avoided his gaze, uncomfortable or disapproving. Determined not to let the incident isolate him, Luis decided to visit the local community center, where he often volunteered. The center was a microcosm of the city's diverse population, a place where people from all walks of life came together. Today, it was buzzing with the usual after-school activities and adult education classes. As he entered, Luis was greeted by Mrs. Linda, the center's director. Her warm smile was a welcome relief. Luis, I've been hearing a lot. How are you feeling? She asked, her concern evident in her tone. Just taking it one day at a time, Linda, Luis replied, trying to muster a smile. It's not easy, but I'm here. Linda nodded, understanding the weight of his words. Well, you know this place is your home too. If there's anything we can do to help. Her offer was interrupted by a group of teenagers approaching Luis, their expressions a mix of curiosity and respect. Mr. Torres, we saw what happened, said a young man named Tommy. It's wrong. We're with you. Their support was direct and honest, typical of the youth he had come to admire and respect. Luis felt a surge of gratitude. Thank you, Tommy. That means a lot. Buoyed by this support, Luis spent the afternoon helping with homework and openly discussing community issues. The conversation naturally drifted toward discussions about prejudice and discrimination. It was a difficult, often painful dialogue, but Luis faced it head-on, facilitating a conversation that was both enlightening and therapeutic. The center organized an impromptu forum to discuss the incident and broader social issues. The room was packed, a testament to the community's commitment and concern. Luis sat in the front row, not as a speaker but as a member of the community, listening and learning from the diverse perspectives shared. As the discussion unfolded, a local activist named Hannah took the floor. What happened to Luis is a symptom of a larger problem, she declared firmly. We need to address not just that incident but the environment that allows such discrimination to thrive. The crowd murmured in agreement. Calls to action were made, from organizing peaceful protests to establishing workshops on racial sensitivity and legal rights. Luis listened, his heart heavy but hopeful. The community was coming together, not just behind him but behind the cause of justice and equality. After the forum, Luis was approached by several people offering handshakes and words of encouragement. Among them was Maria, the waitress from the cafe. She seemed nervous but determined. Mr. Torres, I have something that might help. Can we talk in private? Curious and intrigued, Luis nodded, and they stepped aside. Maria pulled out her phone, her hands slightly trembling. I recorded what that manager said after you left that day. I didn't know if I should, but her voice trailed off as she handed him the phone. The recording was clear, capturing more disrespectful comments and threats made by the manager toward Luis. It was the kind of evidence that could change the entire narrative. Luis looked at Maria, a mix of surprise and gratitude on his face. Maria, this could be significant. Thank you for stepping forward. As they talked further, Luis realized that this evidence not only bolstered his case, but also strengthened the community's resolve to fight against discrimination. It was a turning point, one that marked a shift from passive suffering to active resistance. With the digital recording secured on his phone, Luis, accompanied by Maria, marched to the police station. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air, but Luis felt a surge of cautious optimism. This evidence could potentially turn the tide in his favor. As they approached the reception desk, Luis requested to speak with the officer in charge of handling discrimination complaints. They were quickly ushered into a small, austere room where they met Deputy Chief Perez, a stern man known for his strict approach to law enforcement. Luis explained the situation and played the recording. Maria corroborated the story, her voice firm despite obvious nerves. Perez listened attentively, his expression unreadable. When the recording finished, he sighed, rubbing his temples. "This is serious," Perez admitted. "I'll bring Hank in for questioning immediately." Maria and Luis exchanged a hopeful glance as Perez made some calls. Within hours, Hank was in custody, his arrogance diminished by the formal setting of the police interrogation room. However, the victory was short-lived. By the afternoon, news reached Luis that Hank had been released on bail. More concerning, charges were being brought against Luis for alleged assault during the altercation. The deputy chief, who had seemed supportive, now appeared distant and formal. "Mr. Torres, while the recording raises concerns about Mr. Hank's conduct, there are also allegations against you that we must investigate," Perez explained, his voice firm. "Given Hank's connections in the community and conflicting reports from other witnesses, we're in a difficult position." Stunned, Luis felt the ground shift beneath him. It wasn't just a battle against prejudice now. It was a fight to clear his name of criminal accusations. As they left the station, Luis and Maria sat in his car, the silence between them thick with disbelief. "What now?" Maria finally asked, her eyes full of worry. Luis stared out the window, watching the sunset over the urban landscape. "Now, we fight harder," he said, with a resolve that surprised even himself. "I'm not just going to clear my name. I'm going to expose the corruption that allows men like Hank to get away with this." The days that followed were exhausting. Luis used his knowledge as a lawyer to dig deeper into Hank's past, discovering that Hank was connected to influential figures in Los Angeles, including a prominent councilman known for his conservative views on law enforcement and racial issues. Meanwhile, Maria proved to be an invaluable ally, using her position at the cafe to gather more testimonies from co-workers who had also witnessed Hank's discriminatory behavior but had been too scared to speak up. Together, they compiled a dossier of evidence, not just against Hank, but highlighting the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to continue. As Luis prepared for his own defense, the community rallied around him. Support wasn't just vocal but active, with community leaders organizing protests and legal funds to aid in his case. One night, as Luis and Maria reviewed the gathered evidence in the quiet of his living room, Maria placed her hand on his. "No matter what happens, you're not alone in this," she said sincerely. "You fought for us. Now it's our turn to fight for you." Luis felt a warmth spread through him, not from the setting sun, but from the solidarity that Maria and the community were showing him. This was no longer just his battle. It had become their collective fight for justice. The air was tense as Luis climbed the steps of the Los Angeles courthouse. The overcast sky mirrored the pessimism that had settled over his life since the accusations went public. Flanked by Maria and his lawyer, Luis felt every eye on him as he entered the courthouse, a place he had visited many times before in a very different capacity. Inside, the courtroom was already filling up, the hum of whispered conversations echoing off the high ceilings. Reporters scribbled notes eagerly, their cameras flashing intermittently. Luis took a seat and noticed several of his colleagues from the law firm among the spectators, their expressions ranging from supportive to suspicious. The hearing began with the prosecutor laying out the charges against Luis: assault and public disorder. The evidence presented was a mix of witness statements and security camera footage from the cafe, skillfully edited to highlight Luis's actions without context. Luis's lawyer, an experienced civil rights defender named Jessica, countered fiercely, pointing out inconsistencies in the witness testimonies and highlighting the provocation Luis had faced. She then played Maria's recording, which captured Hank's discriminatory remarks. The courtroom fell silent as the recording played, Hank's words hanging in the air. But the atmosphere shifted when the prosecutor called a surprise witness, Hank himself, looking smug. Hank spun a tale of feeling threatened by Luis, a narrative backed by his connections in the community. As Hank spoke, Luis felt a surge of anger and helplessness. It was clear that Hank was using his influence to manipulate the situation. But before he could dwell on it further, a commotion erupted outside the courtroom. Word of the trial had spread, and a large crowd had gathered in support of Luis. The chants of "Justice for Luis" and "Stop Racial Discrimination" could be heard even through the courthouse's thick walls. The judge, irritated and distracted by the noise, called for a recess. During the break, Luis and Maria stepped outside to see the crowd. The sight of so many people from all walks of life holding signs and chanting in solidarity gave Luis a renewed sense of purpose. Among the crowd, he saw faces from the community center, local activists, and even some of his neighbors. Maria squeezed his hand, whispering, "Look at all the people you've touched, Luis. We won't give up." Returning to the courtroom, they received news that one of Maria's co-workers had found a key piece of evidence, a video taken by a cafe customer that showed the entire incident from a different angle. This video not only captured the full exchange between Luis and Hank, but also the moments leading up to the altercation, offering a clearer picture of Hank's aggressive behavior. Energized by this development and the public support, Luis and Jessica prepared to present this new evidence. But as they did, Luis noticed a pair of plainclothes officers speaking with the prosecutor, their expressions serious. Moments later, they approached Luis with news that would change everything once again. The city councilman connected to Hank was under investigation for corruption, and this case was now part of a broader inquiry. The layers of corruption and influence were beginning to unravel, putting Luis's fight in the context of a larger struggle against systemic abuse and racial injustice. The battle was far from over. But now, with the community behind him and new evidence in hand, Luis felt ready to fight not just for his own name, but for a change in the system that had brought him to this point. As the corruption investigation against the councilman linked to Hank gained momentum, the ramifications spread through the city's political and law enforcement landscapes. The media, previously only moderately interested in Luis's case, now devoted resources to uncovering the depth of corruption that plagued the city. Luis found himself unexpectedly at the center of a story much larger than his own. Luis and Maria worked tirelessly with Jessica to prepare for the upcoming legal battles. But now, their efforts were supported by investigative journalists and whistleblowers who began to come forward. New evidence suggested that Hank's connections were not just influential but part of a broader network that included several high-ranking officials. Public outcry grew as details of the investigation leaked. Protests demanding transparency and accountability from city officials became daily events. Luis, once a solitary figure in his fight for justice, became a symbol of a much larger struggle against systemic corruption and racism. Within the law firm, the atmosphere was tense. Luis's colleagues, previously divided in their opinions, began to see him in a new light as the investigation revealed more about the councilman's influence over legal affairs. Some officers who had remained neutral or skeptical now approached Luis, offering new testimonies and evidence that supported his innocence and highlighted Hank's misconduct. One evening, Luis was called to a meeting with the chief of police and several internal affairs investigators. The chief, a seasoned veteran who had seen his share of city politics, looked tired but resolute. "Mr. Torres, your case has opened a Pandora's box that I suspect is deeper than any of us imagined," began the chief. "We're now looking at a series of questionable actions by the councilman and his associates. This is no longer just about one incident at the cafe." Luis listened, his determination hardening. "Sir, I want to help in any way I can. This isn't just about clearing my name. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else again." The chief nodded, appreciating Luis's commitment. "I'm reinstating you to active service effective immediately. We need attorneys like you on the force, especially now." Later that week, Luis visited the community center, which had become a hub for organizing protests and legal aid sessions. The center was buzzing with activity, and as he entered, Luis was greeted with applause and cheers. It was a marked contrast to the uncertainty and isolation he had felt just a few weeks earlier. Maria, who had been coordinating the community support efforts, updated him. "The councilman is facing charges, and it looks like they're going to make some arrests soon. Hank is also in trouble. They've got evidence linking him to bribery and other illegal activities." As they spoke, a young man approached Luis with a folder. "Mr. Torres, I think you should see this," he said, handing over documents. They were financial records showing transactions between Hank's restaurant and a company owned by the councilman. That night, as Luis pored over the documents, he realized the magnitude of the corruption. This wasn't just about racial discrimination. It was about economic exploitation and control. The community had been manipulated by those who swore to protect and serve them. With new evidence in hand, Luis prepared for the next court date. This time, he wasn't just fighting for his own justice, he was fighting for the soul of the city. The next trial was no longer just about an assault charge. It was a public reckoning for years of systemic abuse. As the city braced for more revelations, Luis stood firm, ready to face whatever came next. He knew the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but with the community's support and the truth on his side, he was determined to see it through to the end. The evening air was crisp as Luis and Maria walked through the bustling community center. Their spirits were high. The recent developments in Luis's case pointed toward a positive resolution, and the community's support had never been stronger. As they walked toward the parking lot, Luis turned to Maria with a grateful smile. "I can't thank you enough for everything. How about dinner tonight on me?" he suggested, his tone light but sincere. Maria smiled back, a touch of color rising to her cheeks. "I'd love that, Luis. It's been a whirlwind, hasn't it?" Her laugh mingled with the soft evening breeze, a rare moment of lightness amid their tumultuous journey. But as they neared Luis's car, the sudden roar of engines cut their conversation short. Six masked, menacing motorcyclists rounded the corner, speeding toward them. Luis's hand instinctively reached for his side, only to remember he had left his ID in the car. The color drained from his face as one of the motorcyclists pulled out a gun, aiming directly at him. Time seemed to slow as Luis's life flashed before his eyes. The painful loss of his wife during childbirth, the brief life of his son whom he never got to know, and now, what seemed like the end of his own story on a quiet city street. But fate had other plans. In a second that felt like an eternity, Maria stepped in front of him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. The gunshot rang out loudly in the evening air, and Maria collapsed into Luis's arms. "No, Maria, no," Luis cried out, his voice breaking as he gently lowered her to the ground, pressing his hand against the wound in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. "This isn't your time," Maria whispered, her voice weak. "You have to fight, not just for yourself, but for everyone who has been wronged." As the motorcyclists disappeared into the twilight, Luis's screams finally summoned an ambulance. He rode with Maria to the hospital, his mind numb with shock and his heart heavy with guilt. At the hospital, after hours of anxious waiting, a surgeon approached Luis. "She's stable but still in critical condition. We've done all we can for now. She needs time to recover." Luis nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He watched through the window as the medical team worked around Maria, her condition precarious but stable. When he was finally allowed to see her, the sight of Maria, so vibrant and fierce, now lying silent and pale, was almost more than he could bear. Sitting beside her bed, Luis took her hand, his tears falling freely. "You shouldn't have had to do that, Maria. You've already done so much," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He stayed there all night, grappling with the enormity of Maria's sacrifice and the ongoing danger they both faced. His determination hardened. This fight was no longer just his. It was for Maria, for his late wife and son, and for anyone who had suffered injustice. At dawn, Luis looked up from Maria's still form and whispered a prayer, not just for her recovery, but for strength. He knew the road ahead would be filled with more challenges, but he was no longer alone in his fight. Luis sat in the dim glow of the hospital room, the steady, if unnerving, comfort of the monitors providing a constant, though unsettling, reassurance. He hadn't left Maria's side since she was admitted, his concern growing with each passing hour. Despite his exhaustion, Luis kept his phone close, coordinating with his colleagues who were tirelessly searching for any trace of the motorcyclists. By dawn, as the light filtered into the room, casting long shadows on the sterile walls, the door opened quietly. Maria's parents, whom Luis had never met, entered, their expressions filled with worry that quickly turned to disapproval upon seeing Luis. You're the lawyer she's been helping? Maria's father asked, his voice tense. Yes, sir. I'm Luis Torres. We know who you are, Maria's mother interrupted brusquely, and you need to leave. It's your fault our daughter is here. Stunned, Luis stood up, his intention to explain himself cut off by the pain in their eyes. He understood their anger, even if it was misplaced, and nodded slowly. I'm so sorry. I just want Maria to be okay, he murmured before quietly leaving the room. Luis didn't go far. He settled in the hospital lobby, a silent guardian waiting for any news. Throughout the night, the nurses passed by him, offering sympathetic glances and occasionally a coffee, acknowledging the torment of a loved one reflected in his tired eyes. Morning light brought a change. Maria's parents emerged from the elevator, their overnight bags in hand. Seeing Luis, they hesitated. The resolve in their eyes, the evident lack of sleep, and his unwavering presence softened their initial judgment. Mr. Torres, Maria's father began, his voice gentler, we saw you didn't leave last night. We're sorry for what we said. Luis stood, his respect for their pain still at the forefront. I understand. It's a difficult time for all of us. Just then, a nurse hurried out of the ICU, her face bright. She's awake, and she's asking for Luis. Maria's parents exchanged a glance, the realization of their error dawning fully. Without a word, they gestured for Luis to follow them back to Maria's room. Inside, Maria's face, weak but smiling, turned toward the door. Luis, she whispered, her voice hoarse but filled with warmth. Luis rushed to her side, taking her hand gently, tears springing to his eyes as he looked at her, overwhelmed with relief. I'm here, Maria. You're going to be okay. Maria's parents stood back, watching the reunion, their initial hostility replaced by growing respect for the man their daughter had defended and supported so fervently. I'm sorry, Luis, Maria's mother said, stepping forward. We didn't understand how much you meant to each other, or how much you've been through together. Luis shook his head slightly, dismissing their apologies. There's nothing to forgive. I'm just grateful she's awake. The room filled with a new air, lighter as the earlier tension dissipated. Maria squeezed Luis's hand, her strength growing with the support surrounding her. The hospital room was quiet, except for the soft hum of machines and the distant sounds of activity in the hallways. Luis sat by Maria's bed, his eyes studying her face, which, despite the pallor and fatigue, was filled with determination. Maria, Luis began, his voice low and cautious. I need to understand. Why did you do what you did? Taking a bullet isn't something someone does lightly. Maria shifted slightly in her bed, her gaze meeting his. There was a depth in her eyes, a mix of pain and resolve. Luis, you've become more than a friend to me, more than a colleague fighting for justice, she said, her voice firm despite her condition. Luis listened intently, his heart heavy with a mix of admiration and guilt. You represent something bigger, Luis, Maria continued. You represent a fight that many have been losing for a long time, against prejudice, against corruption. You've given hope where there was resignation. Your fight isn't just yours, it's ours, for all of us who have faced discrimination and felt powerless. Luis's eyes widened slightly, the weight of her words sinking in. Maria, she raised a hand, stopping him. Let me finish. It's not just about the cause, Luis. These past weeks, being with you, fighting alongside you, I've come to feel more than admiration. I've come to care deeply about you. Her cheeks flushed slightly, the confession hanging between them like a delicate thread. Luis was silent for a moment, the implications of her words spinning in his mind. The realization that their relationship had evolved into something deeper was both surprising and not. The long hours together, the shared purpose, the mutual support had all laid the groundwork for something more profound than either had anticipated. Maria, Luis struggled to find the right words. I care about you too, more than I ever thought possible in such a short time. But I never wanted you to risk your life for me. Maria smiled weakly. I know, and I didn't make that decision lightly. But in that moment, I couldn't bear the thought of losing you. Not just for me, but for what losing you would mean for the cause. You have to finish this fight, Luis, For all of us. The room fell silent again. The only sound the soft beeping of the heart monitor. They sat there, connected by an understanding that had been tacit until now. Now a bond forged not just by shared ideals but by personal sacrifices and a newly discovered affection. Luis squeezed her hand, his grip gentle but firm. I promise you, Maria, your sacrifice won't be in vain. We'll see this through together. Maria nodded, her eyes closing briefly as if sealing the promise. Together, she whispered. The atmosphere in the hospital room had settled into a quiet routine, with Luis often at Maria's bedside as she continued to recover. Their conversations, once filled with discussions about strategies and justice, now also included more personal and profound topics. However, the fight outside the hospital walls was far from over, and both were acutely aware of the challenges that still lay ahead. Their contemplative silence was broken by the abrupt arrival of Detective Gomez, a close colleague of Luis from the law firm. He entered the room with an urgency that immediately put Luis on alert. Luis, we've got one of them, Gomez announced, his voice a mix of fatigue and excitement. One of the motorcyclists was captured last night in a raid. He's talking, and it looks like we might finally get some answers. Luis straightened, his focus sharpening. Do we know who orchestrated the attack? Not yet, but this guy seems willing to spill everything to avoid a long sentence, Gomez replied, glancing at Maria with a nod of respect. Maria met Luis's gaze, her expression a mix of hope and apprehension. This could be the breakthrough we needed, Luis. Luis nodded, his mind racing with the implications. I need to be there, Gomez. I need to hear it for myself. Gomez agreed, and within an hour, Luis was at the law firm, sitting behind the one-way mirror of the interrogation room. The motorcyclist, a burly man with a defiant look, seemed to be crumbling under the weight of his situation. After hours of intense questioning, the motorcyclist finally broke. All right. It wasn't my idea, okay? I was just following orders, he blurted out, his voice cracking with desperation. Whose orders? The lead detective pressed, his voice stern. The motorcyclist hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Finally, he exhaled sharply. It was Hank. Hank orchestrated the whole thing. Said the lawyer was causing too much trouble, getting too close to something big. The room fell silent as the detectives absorbed the revelation. Luis, listening from behind the mirror, felt a cold fury settle in his chest. Hank's revenge had escalated far beyond what any of them had imagined. The detectives worked quickly after that, coordinating raids to capture the remaining motorcyclists, including the shooter. When the last motorcyclist was caught, he confirmed the initial story, adding chilling details about how Hank had promised them protection under his influential connections. Luis returned to the hospital, his emotions a tumultuous mix of relief and anger. As he entered Maria's room, he saw her looking expectantly at him. We've got them all, Maria. It was Hank who orchestrated the attack, Luis explained, his voice tense. Maria's expression hardened with a determination that matched Luis's. Then this isn't over. This goes beyond just a street vendetta. It's a corruption rooted in power. Luis felt his resolve renewed by Maria's words. We'll take them down, Maria. All of them. No one else should have to suffer because of their greed and hatred. In the quiet of the hospital room, with only the soft beeping of monitors and the distant murmurs of the night staff, Luis sat beside Maria, both lost in their thoughts. The dim light from the bedside lamp cast long shadows across the room, mirroring the somber mood that enveloped them. Maria, looking stronger but still fragile, turned to Luis, her voice soft. Can you believe it all started with just a lunch? A simple decision to go to the cafe. Luis sighed, running his fingers through his hair, a tired smile touching his lips. Feels like a lifetime ago. I just wanted a sandwich, and now here we are, caught up in something that feels so much bigger than us. Maria reached out, finding his hand. But it's not just about us, is it? It's about standing up to something that's been wrong for far too long. Hank's prejudice, his corruption. It's like a symbol of everything that's gone unchallenged until now. Luis felt his eyes reflect a mix of anger and resolve. Yeah, his contempt wasn't just aimed at me. It's clear now that he's been manipulating and hurting many more. His actions are part of a broader pattern that we see far too often. They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts about the events that had transpired. Luis broke the silence, his voice tinged with a mix of awe and concern. "Did you ever think that standing up in that moment would lead us here?" Maria smiled weakly, a spark of her usual fire flickering in her eyes. "I didn't know where it would lead, just that it was the right thing to do. But seeing how far Hank was willing to go, how deep his hatred and corruption ran, it scares me." "It scares me too," Luis admitted, "but it also strengthens my resolve. We've exposed it, and now we can't back down. We have to see this through to the end, not just for us, but for everyone who's been on the receiving end of such blatant injustice." Maria squeezed his hand, her grip firm despite her weakness. "I know, and I'll be with you every step of the way. What you're doing, what we're fighting for, matters. It's bigger than just getting justice for what happened at the cafe, or even what happened to me. It's about changing how things are done, about holding people like Hank accountable." Luis looked out the window, where the city lights twinkled against the night sky. "When this is over, I want to make sure that no one else has to go through what you went through, what so many others have gone through." "And we will," Maria said, her voice resolute, "with the help of others." The hospital, once a sanctuary of healing, had transformed overnight into a fortress. The news that Hank had gone missing after learning of the motorcyclist's confession sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. Luis, sitting in the hospital room with Maria, listened intently as Detective Gomez laid out the situation. "We want to bring Hank in, but he's gone. He left a note mocking us, saying we'll never catch him," Gomez informed, his frustration evident. "He's now officially a fugitive, and considering what's at stake, he might be desperate." Luis's jaw tightened as he processed the news. "What about Maria's safety and the hospital staff?" "We've increased security around the hospital, with undercover officers in every wing and regular patrols around the clock," Gomez assured. "We're not taking any chances." Maria, who had been listening silently, spoke up, her voice firm despite the clear danger. "What about the others Hank might go after? Anyone related to the case could be at risk?" Gomez nodded. "We're coordinating with local law enforcement to provide protection for all key witnesses and their families. We're casting a wide net to find Hank before he can make any moves." The tension in the room was palpable as the realization set in that desperation could lead to unpredictable actions. Luis looked out the window, his mind racing with scenarios, each more unsettling than the last. Later that night, as the city's lights flickered on against the encroaching darkness, the hospital's halls buzzed with a quiet tension. Security personnel discreetly patrolled the area, their presence reassuring but a stark reminder of the looming threat. Luis and Maria, confined to the hospital room, found themselves grappling with the weight of their situation. "This is exactly what Hank wants," Luis said, pacing the room. "He wants us to be afraid, to hide. It's his way of taking back control." Maria reached out, taking his hand to stop him. "Then let's not let him win. Let's stay strong and see this through to the end. The police are doing everything they can to find him." Luis nodded, the determination firm in his eyes. "And we'll be ready for him if he tries anything. I won't let anyone else get hurt because of him." The night passed with intense vigilance. Luis barely slept, his senses alert to every sound, every shadow passing under the door. By morning, the hospital had taken on the air of a guarded compound, with police officers and security personnel constantly moving. As dawn broke, Luis stood by the window, watching as the city woke up. The fear that had gripped him the night before had settled into a determined anger. He knew the road ahead would be dangerous, but he was committed to ending Hank's reign of terror for the sake of Maria, the city, and himself. The city had never felt more like a battlefield. From the improvised command center at the law firm, Detective Gomez and his team coordinated a citywide search for Hank. The urgency was palpable. Every officer knew the stakes were higher than ever. Maps plastered on every wall were marked with possible sightings and areas of interest. Teams of officers, assisted by federal agents, swept through known hideouts and places where Hank was rumored to frequent. Every lead was followed with precision and speed, but Hank remained elusive, always seemingly one step ahead. "Keep the pressure on," Gomez instructed his team. He can't stay hidden forever. Follow every lead, no matter how small it seems. Meanwhile, surveillance footage from traffic cameras, ATMs, and public spaces was meticulously reviewed around the clock. Analysts worked tirelessly, their eyes glued to screens, searching for any trace of Hank or his associates. As the search intensified, Luis received regular updates from Gomez. Despite being confined to the hospital, he felt an unrelenting drive to contribute, using his own contacts and knowledge of the city to provide insights and suggestions on where Hank might try to hide. One afternoon, a breakthrough occurred. A traffic camera captured a glimpse of a vehicle matching Hank's description heading toward an industrial area of the city. The footage was grainy, but the license plate matched one of Hank's known vehicles. "We've got him," one of the analysts exclaimed, zooming in on the image. Sending units now, Gomez coordinated the response, dispatching SWAT teams and setting up a perimeter around the suspect location, a rundown warehouse district that had seen better days. The area was quickly cordoned off, with no one allowed in or out without strict verification. "Be careful, Gomez. He's desperate, and that makes him dangerous," Luis warned over the phone. "We're prepared, Luis. We'll get him," Gomez assured, his voice resolute on the other end of the line. As the SWAT teams moved in, the tension reached a breaking point. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights cutting through the dusk as officers on the ground advanced in tactical formations. The operation was executed with clinical precision, each team member aware that any mistake could have fatal consequences. After hours of careful maneuvering, the moment of truth arrived. Hank was found hiding in a decrepit storage room, but he looked cornered and defeated. The standoff was tense, with officers pointing guns at him from all angles. "Surrender, Hank. It's over," ordered the commanding officer. Hank, sweaty and trembling, knew he had no way out. With a grimace of defeat, he threw his weapon to the ground, raising his hands in surrender. The relief among the team was palpable as Hank was handcuffed and taken away. Gomez, watching the arrest through a live feed in the command center, let out a long sigh of relief. "Good job, team. Let's bring him in." The city had been following the case with bated breath, and the day of Hank's trial brought crowds both inside and outside the courthouse. Media vans lined the streets, and reporters jostled for comments from anyone remotely involved. Amid this frenzy, Luis entered the courthouse, his steps firm but his mind racing with anticipation and anxiety. Inside, the courtroom was packed, a tangible buzz of conversation filling the air until the judge entered and the room fell into a respectful silence. Luis sat at the back, his eyes never leaving Hank, who looked defiant but visibly nervous as he conferred with his lawyer. The prosecution opened with a powerful statement, laying out the case against Hank for orchestrating the attempted murder of a lawyer, obstruction of justice, and his involvement in a deeper network of corruption and racial hatred. The evidence was overwhelming, including testimonies from the captured motorcyclists, surveillance footage, and the crucial recording Maria had made at the cafe. As the trial progressed, Maria, now significantly recovered, took the stand. Her testimony was calm but firm as she recounted the events leading to her injury, pointing directly to Hank's role in escalating the violence. When asked why she stepped in front of Luis, her response was simple yet profound. "Because it was the right thing to do, and because I knew what Hank was capable of." Luis listened, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and pain. When it was his turn, he detailed his interactions with Hank, the derogatory comments, and the threats. His voice didn't waver as it echoed through the courtroom, each word underlining the danger and discrimination he had faced. The defense tried to paint Hank as a misunderstood businessman who had been framed by an overzealous attorney, but the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses from the community, including other victims of Hank's discriminatory practices, reinforced the prosecution's case, painting a clear picture of a man who used his power to intimidate and harm. After days of intense testimony and legal arguments, the case was handed over to the jury. The wait for the verdict was agonizing. Luis and Maria, along with friends, family, and a significant portion of the community, held vigil outside the courthouse, waiting for justice. Finally, the jury returned, and the courtroom fell into an almost eerie silence as the four persons stood. In the case of the state versus Hank, we find the defendant guilty on all counts. A wave of relief and jubilation swept through the courtroom, cheers erupting from the public gallery as Luis and Maria embraced. Tears of relief mixing with smiles of victory. Hank was led away, his future now confined to the consequences of his actions. Outside the courthouse, Luis addressed the gathered crowd, his words broadcast live. Today's verdict isn't just a victory for me. It's a victory for every person who's been told they don't belong, for every voice that's been silenced by fear. It's a step toward a future where justice and decency prevail over hatred and corruption. After the tumultuous events and high-profile trial, the city began to show signs of healing and change. Luis and Maria, now widely recognized as symbols of courage and justice, found themselves at the forefront of community efforts to promote inclusion and accountability. Luis, having taken a brief sabbatical from the law firm to recover and reflect, returned with a new role. He was asked to lead a community liaison team, a new division dedicated to building bridges between the legal system and the communities they serve. His first-hand experiences, along with his unwavering commitment to justice, made him a respected figure not only among his colleagues but also among the citizens. Maria, for her part, channeled her passion into activism, working with local organizations to support victims of racial discrimination and violence. Her recovery had only strengthened her resolve, and her story inspired many to speak out and fight against injustice. Together, they organized workshops and talks, not just in their city but in neighboring towns, sharing their story and the lessons they had learned about resilience, justice, and the power of community support. Amid their public commitments, Luis and Maria also found time for personal growth. They often visited schools and universities, speaking with students about civil rights, the legal system, and the importance of community activism. Their relationship, forged in the fires of conflict and trauma, had blossomed into a deep and lasting partnership. Luis proposed to Maria at the very restaurant where their ordeal began, now under new management and transformed into a symbol of community unity. It was a poignant moment, marked by personal triumph and collective healing. The impact of their case had far-reaching implications. Legislation was introduced to ensure stricter oversight of legal interactions with the community, and a foundation was established in Maria's name to provide legal assistance to those who could not afford it. As the city's landscape changed, so did its heart. The restaurant became a community center on weekends, hosting events that brought diverse groups together to share meals and stories, fostering understanding and compassion among its residents. One crisp autumn evening, Luis and Maria walked through a revitalized neighborhood, leaves crunching underfoot. They stopped in front of a mural that depicted several community leaders, including likenesses of both of them, painted by a local artist. "Look, Maria," Luis said, leaning into her. "We're part of the city's story now." Maria wrapped an arm around him, her gaze thoughtful. "And we're part of its future, too. What we went through changed us, but it also changed this place for the better." They continued their walk, their conversation turning to plans for their upcoming wedding and other community projects. They knew the road ahead would have its challenges, but they faced it with optimism and determination, supported by a community that had learned the value of standing together. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like, and don't miss the next video. This other video, probably appearing on the screen now, will also move you.